the town that disappeared in a storm. The storm that began it all. The storm was unlike any other that had ever been seen in those parts. They called it the Whispering Storm, for it wasn't the wind or the rain that caused the most unease, but the strange eerie whispers that seemed to come from the very air itself. It was said that those whispers held secrets old as the land, ones meant to stay buried in the forgotten corners of time. It was the year of 1892, a time when the heart of America was still wild and untamed. The town of Ash Hollow, nestled deep in the misty hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, was a small, close-knit community. The folks of Ash Hollow lived their days in quiet harmony with the land. Their lives were simple, working the fields, tending to cattle, and gathering in the evenings around a crackling fire to share stories of the past, handed down from one generation to the next. But on that fateful night, something stirred in the wind. As dusk fell and the air thickened with the scent of impending rain, the people of Ash Hollow gathered in the town hall, seeking shelter from what was rumored to be a fierce storm. The old ones whispered about it in hushed tones, speaking of an omen, a storm unlike any that had ever passed through the valley. Maggie Miller, the young schoolteacher, had heard the legends of the storm. Her grandmother, an old woman of the hills, had often told her stories of how storms like this one had been known to bring about strange happenings in the land. People would disappear without a trace. Buildings, once standing proud, would crumble into the earth as if swallowed whole. And the worst of it all, the one thing Maggie had always found most unsettling, was the disappearance of whole towns, erased from the map as if they'd never existed. That evening, Maggie had invited some of the children from the village to stay with her in the hall, away from the growing storm. The wind howled louder, like a pack of wolves calling to each other in the distance. The villagers, too, huddled together in anxious anticipation. The storm's fury was already upon them, but it was the eerie, distant rumbling that unsettled them the most. As the clock struck midnight, the first drop of rain fell, a cold, sharp chill that seemed to freeze the very bones. The storm came quickly and just as swiftly, it engulfed the town. The wind tore at the shutters, sending the trees outside into a violent frenzy. The people inside the hall heard a low rumble, like the growl of a beast stirring in the depths of the earth, but louder, more deliberate. The storm had a life of its own and the whole town felt it. Maggie had been pacing nervously, watching the storm through the small window that faced the town square. Her eyes widened as she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. There was a figure standing in the middle of the square, under the flickering light of a street lamp. The wind howled, and the figure seemed to shimmer like a mirage, fading in and out of sight. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she squinted, trying to make sense of what she saw. "Who is that out there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Old Man Jenkins, who had lived in Ash Hollow longer than anyone, peered over her shoulder. His face went pale as he saw the figure, his hands gripping the back of her chair. "That's no one," he muttered, but his voice betrayed the fear he tried to conceal. "That's the spirit of the storm." Maggie turned to him, confused. "The spirit of the storm?" "Aye," Jenkins whispered. "Ain't no ordinary storm, this one. It comes every 100 years, but the town that sees it, it never sees the morning sun again." The words sent a shiver down Maggie's spine, and she turned back to the window, watching as the figure slowly moved, disappearing into the shadows. The town hall doors slammed open with a crash, and the wind blew inside, sending papers flying and the candlelight flickering wildly. And then, as if by some unnatural force, the storm ceased. The wind stopped howling and the rain turned into a mere drizzle. The calmness was unsettling, almost too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Maggie stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. Outside, the town square was now eerily silent. The figure that had stood there just moments before had vanished, and in its place, a dense fog began to rise from the ground, creeping slowly over the cobblestones as if it were a living thing. The villagers who had gathered in the hall now stood at the window, staring into the night, their faces pale, their eyes wide. "What in the name of God is happening?" whispered one of the women, clutching her child close to her chest. Maggie felt her legs weaken beneath her. The quiet was suffocating. She had heard the legends, yes, but never did she think she would witness them firsthand. She could feel something pulling at the very fabric of the town, something dark and ancient and just beyond her reach. The first person to speak was Mr. Thompson, the town's blacksmith. "We need to leave. We can't stay here, not with that fog rising." But it was too late. The town was already lost. One by one, the people of Ash Hollow disappeared. Some said they were taken by the storm's spirit. Others swore they heard footsteps in the fog, voices calling their names in the night. The townspeople tried to leave, to run, but the streets, once familiar, now twisted and turned in unnatural ways. Buildings that were standing just moments before had vanished, as though they'd never been there at all. As dawn began to break, Maggie found herself standing alone in the middle of the square, the fog swallowing the town whole. The whispering storm had done its work, and the town of Ash Hollow had vanished into the ether, its people never to be seen again. And so, the legend of the town that disappeared in a storm was born. To this day, travelers who pass through that part of the Appalachian Mountains speak of the strange fog that rises at night, and the eerie whispers that ride on the wind. Some say that if you listen carefully enough, you can hear the voices of the lost townsfolk, calling out in the night, begging for release from the storm's eternal grip. But no one has ever found Ash Hollow again. Not yet. The return of the storm. Years passed, but the memory of Ash Hollow never truly faded from the minds of those who had heard the stories. Whispers of the town's disappearance traveled from mouth to mouth, across state lines, and from one generation to the next. No one could explain it, no one could understand it, but the eerie legend of Ash Hollow lingered like a shadow in the Appalachian mist, an unfinished tale that continued to stir a deep unease in the hearts of those who dared to listen. In the year 1923, a curious young man named Samuel Walker found himself drawn to the mystery. He had spent his youth hearing old men and women tell tales around campfires, speaking in hushed tones about the cursed town and its sudden disappearance. Samuel, however, was not one for superstition. His mind was practical, grounded in science and reason, and he believed the stories were merely the products of overactive imaginations, spun together by generations of townsfolk. But Samuel's fascination with the tale was undeniable, and as he reached adulthood, he made it his mission to find the truth behind the legend. With a map in hand and a sense of determination in his heart, Samuel set off for the Appalachian Mountains. He had heard that the area where Ash Hollow had once stood was now nothing but wild terrain, overtaken by thick forests and steep ridges, a place no one dared to enter. But Samuel was resolute. He was determined to uncover the truth and return with proof, whether it be the remains of the vanished town or, at the very least, some rational explanation for its disappearance. Samuel's journey took him deep into the heart of the mountains, following forgotten trails, crossing winding rivers, and braving the dense thickets of woods that seemed to grow thicker the further he went. He had no map of Ash Hollow, only the descriptions he had gathered from the few townsfolk who still remembered its name. Their warnings were always the same: don't go looking for Ash Hollow. It's cursed. Let it rest. But Samuel paid them no heed. He laughed at their superstitions, thinking them relics of an old world that had no place in the rational era he lived in. On the third day of his trek, Samuel reached the point where the town had once stood. He was tired and sore, and the weight of his pack seemed heavier now than it had at the start of his journey. The land here was eerily quiet. There was no sound of birds, no rustling of leaves, not even the chirping of insects. The silence was absolute. It felt as though the very air held its breath, waiting for something. Samuel paused, surveying the area. All that lay before him was an empty stretch of land. No buildings, no roadways, no signs of the town that had been here so long ago. At first, Samuel was disappointed. "It's just an old ghost story," he muttered to himself. "The town's gone, nothing more to see." But something about the stillness unsettled him. It was too perfect, too undisturbed. The forest around him was thick with ancient trees, their gnarled roots snaking up through the ground as if they had been there for centuries. But there was no trace of civilization. No remnants of the buildings that had once stood proudly in Ash Hollow. As the day began to fade into dusk, Samuel made camp near a small creek, its water running clear and fast. He built a fire, hoping it would bring him some comfort in the stillness of the woods. The flickering light cast long shadows, making the trees around him look like twisted figures from some ancient nightmare. He was about to settle in for the night when he heard it, a faint whisper. It was almost imperceptible, carried on the wind, just beyond his hearing, like a distant voice murmuring his name. "Samuel?" The sound froze him in place. He stood up, heart pounding in his chest, and scanned the darkening forest around him. There was no one there. Only the wind and the trees. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But deep down, something told him it wasn't the wind. As night fell, the air grew colder and the shadows deepened. Samuel lay in his sleeping bag, trying to ignore the chill creeping into his bones. But sleep eluded him. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable. They seemed to echo from all around him, drifting through the branches above, whispering in a language he couldn't understand. The words were indecipherable, but they carried a weight, an ancient sorrow, a longing for release. Suddenly, the ground beneath him seemed to shift as if the earth itself was alive. Samuel sprang to his feet, his senses on high alert. The earth trembled once, then twice, and then the sky above him darkened in an unnatural way. The storm had come. At first, it was just a light drizzle, the kind of rain that falls softly, almost like a whisper in the night. But then, as if summoned by the eerie whispers, the storm grew violent. Wind howled through the trees, bending them to their breaking point. The rain poured down in torrents, drenching Samuel instantly. And then the fog rolled in. Thick, heavy, suffocating fog that rose up from the ground like smoke from a fire. And then, amidst the chaos of the storm, Samuel heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and moving closer. He turned, his eyes scanning the fog, but he could see nothing, just the swirling mist that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The footsteps grew louder. Closer. Closer still. "Who's there?" Samuel shouted, his voice trembling with both fear and frustration. He couldn't see anything but the footsteps. They were real. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was real. And then from the depths of the fog, a figure emerged. A tall man, draped in a long flowing coat that seemed to ripple like the mist itself, stood before Samuel. His face was shadowed, but his eyes burned with an unnatural light, cold and lifeless. "Welcome back, Samuel," the figure said, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. Samuel stumbled backward, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want?" The figure's lips curled into a knowing smile, but he did not answer. Instead, he stepped forward, and the fog thickened around them. The storm raged on, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the very storm was speaking to him, calling him back to where it all began. For the first time, Samuel realized that Ash Hollow had never disappeared at all. It had been waiting for him, waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. And now, the storm had returned to claim what was always meant to be lost. But where was the town? Where was Ash Hollow? The figure raised a hand, and Samuel's heart skipped a beat as he saw the faint outline of a street lamp flicker to life behind the man. It was as if the town, the very one that had vanished, was rising from the earth itself. He blinked, his eyes straining against the fog, but it was there, just beyond the mist, a shadow of a place that should not be. The storm was only the beginning. The town that never left. Samuel stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure before him, tall, imposing, with eyes that burned through the fog, did not speak further. He merely stepped aside, motioning toward the distant glow of the street lamp. The air around Samuel thickened, and the whispers that had tormented him seemed to grow louder, more coherent, as though they were speaking directly to him now. The figure's silence was suffocating. Samuel's mind raced as the storm raged around him, but his feet refused to move. The very earth beneath him seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though the land itself was alive, pulling him toward the spectral town that was beginning to take shape before his eyes. The fog parted like a curtain, revealing what looked like a road, a cobblestone street lit by faint street lamps that flickered in the storm. On either side, the remnants of houses rose out of the mist, their outlines ghostly, as if they had been lost to time and now were reappearing only for him. The buildings were aged and weathered, their once vibrant paint chipped and faded, and the windows were dark, empty, like eyes that had seen too much. But the strangest part was the absence of people. No movement. No sound except the howling wind and the incessant murmur of the whispers. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He had heard the legends of Ash Hollow, a town that had vanished in a storm over 30 years ago. But this wasn't just a ghost story, it was something far darker, more tangible. This was the town, the one that had disappeared, re-emerging from the depths of the fog. It hadn't been erased from the world, not truly. It had been hidden away, waiting for the right moment to return. As the figure continued to stand motionless, Samuel couldn't help himself. He stepped forward, drawn to the eerie beauty of the town. His footsteps echoed in the silence, but the closer he got to the center of the street, the more he felt like he was being watched, like the very buildings themselves were alive, aware of his presence. And then, from behind the old wooden doors of a nearby house, a low creak sounded, followed by a faint rustle. Samuel spun around, his pulse quickening. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow move across one of the windows, a figure standing just behind the glass, watching him. He squinted, but the shadow vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky but firm. There was no answer, only the relentless storm and the deepening fog. But then he heard something, soft footsteps from behind him, as if someone or something was approaching. He spun around again, but no one was there. The street was empty just as it had been before. Suddenly, the figure in front of him spoke again. His voice was smooth, almost soothing, but there was something undeniably sinister about it. "The town has been waiting for you, Samuel." Samuel's heart clenched in his chest. "Waiting for me? What do you mean?" The figure tilted his head, his smile stretching wider, colder. "Ash Hollow doesn't let go so easily. It never truly disappeared. It only hides, waits for the next soul curious enough to find it. And now you found it." Samuel's mind raced. The storm, the whispers, the strange sensation that he was no longer in the world he knew, it was all coming together. But why him? Why had this town, lost in time, called out to him? And why did it feel like the town had a life of its own? The figure took a step closer, the fog swirling around him like an extension of his body. "Do you know why it disappeared, Samuel? Do you know what the town is hiding?" Samuel didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He was terrified, but his curiosity burned brighter than his fear. "You see," the figure continued, his voice like the creaking of old wood, "the people of Ash Hollow never left. Not entirely. They are still here, caught between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They've been waiting, trapped in this place, ever since the storm. Some say the storm was a punishment, others say it was a curse. But the truth is it was a reckoning. The town's sins caught up with it, and now no one can leave, not unless the curse is broken." Samuel's legs felt weak, but he refused to sit. He had to understand. "How do I break it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The figure chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "You can't. No one ever has. That's the cruel beauty of Ash Hollow. It is both a prison and a sanctuary, a place where time stands still, and yet it moves in cycles, always waiting for the next lost soul to stumble in, never to leave." The storm intensified. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the town in stark white light. Samuel's eyes were wide and his pulse raced. He knew deep down that this wasn't just a story. This wasn't some ghost town or abandoned place. Ash Hollow was alive, and it had claimed him as its next prisoner. Without thinking, Samuel turned and ran, his feet pounding against the cobblestone streets. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. But as he ran, the streets twisted and turned in unnatural ways. The buildings seemed to shift, closing in around him as if the town itself was rearranging to trap him. The fog thickened, blinding him, and the whispers grew louder, louder still, until they seemed to surround him, echoing in his ears. "Samuel, Samuel, stay with us. Stay forever." His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the fog, not daring to stop. But when he reached the end of the street, there was no escape. The world before him had vanished, and all that remained was the same eerie town, locked in time. He turned back, and the figure was there, waiting for him, standing at the entrance to the street, blocking his way. "Did you think you could leave?" the figure asked, his voice a dark promise. "Ash Hollow never lets go." Samuel's heart sank. He had come to uncover the truth, but now he knew it. There was no escaping Ash Hollow. It had always been there waiting, and now it had claimed him too. The storm raged on, and the whispers of the lost townsfolk filled the air, a chorus of voices calling to him, welcoming him to the place that could never be found again. Ash Hollow was gone, but it was never truly lost. It would remain waiting, forever.